Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take sources, really peel back the layers, and try to find those insightful nuggets you didn't even know you were looking for. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating and deeply personal piece. It's a monologue called I'm Gay and I'm Staying. It's by the writer who's also known as Oliver Werner Neidinger, and it's just a powerful reflection on identity, community, what belonging really means, especially when you feel like the ground is kind of shifting under your feet.
Yeah, and what's so interesting here, I think, is that it's not just a personal story. It really taps into these broader societal trends, doesn't it? And tensions within communities that are, well, constantly evolving. So our mission today really is to unpack Neidinger's perspective, look at the pain, the questions he raises, and this profound call for connection that comes through. It really gives us a unique lens, I think, to look at the complexities of identity movements today.
Okay, let's dig in then. This piece, it just hits you straight away with this raw honesty, right? Going deep into the feelings of someone who senses this growing distance, a distance from a community they actually helped build. So as we start looking at this, what's the very first thing that jumps out at you from his opening words?
Well, the thing that's immediately striking and honestly quite unsettling is where he says the deepest hurt is coming from. He's crystal clear. It doesn't come from the usual suspects, not conservatives, not bigots, not strangers.
Yeah.
No, he says the worst hurt comes from people under the same flag, from his own community.
Wow.
And the specific thing that cuts deepest, that accusation, we can't even talk to you anymore. And that's not just like a minor disagreement. It points to a huge shift, I think, in how conflict happens within these movements.
How so?
Well, historically, the LGBTQIA plus movement, for example, it mostly faced external fights, right? Societal prejudice, legal battles, outright hate. But Neidinger's experience, it suggests this internal fracturing, where the very community that's supposed to be your sanctuary, your support,
becomes the source of the pain.
Exactly. It becomes, paradoxically, a source of alienation. It speaks to this profound sense of betrayal, doesn't it? Yeah. Being pushed out or silenced by the people who should be your allies. Just because you ask questions or have reservations or maybe don't jump on every single new idea instantly.
Yeah, that feeling of being misunderstood by your own side.
It often feels worse, more devastating than attacks from outside because it hits the foundation of belonging, of trust within your chosen family, your ideological home.
That's a really crucial point. And it's not just a vague feeling, is it? He describes this immediate escalation into what we could call a labeling dilemma. He talks about being hit with these incredibly harsh labels, transphobic, backwards, not queer enough. And why? Simply for doing things he sees as basic honesty, asking questions, not just nodding along, admitting he feels, quote, overwhelmed by how fast things are changing. And, this dynamic, it really goes beyond just the LGBTQIA plus community, doesn't it? It connects to something pretty universal.
Absolutely.
Think about any group you've been in, work, a club, even family. Haven't we all felt that pressure sometimes, that discomfort, maybe even fear of being labeled or dismissed?
Yeah.
Just for sharing a view that's maybe a bit different or admitting you're struggling with something or saying, hang on, I don't quite get this yet, especially when the main narrative is moving so fast.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this labeling thing you mentioned, it raises a really fundamental question about how dialogue works inside identity groups. Is there actual space for nuance, for individual struggle, or maybe for just different perspectives? Or do certain opinions just automatically trigger these dismissive labels?
Right, shutting down the conversation.
Exactly. It mirrors what people sometimes call purity tests in social movements, where you have to adhere to this increasingly strict and fast-changing ideological standard. And that becomes the test for whether you belong. And if you fail it, you can face pretty quick social fallout, maybe even being canceled from inside the group itself.
So the labels aren't really descriptive anymore.
Often, they function less as descriptions and more as ways to just stop the conversation. It creates this atmosphere where dissent, or even just genuine questions, can be treated like hostility. And the response can be really swift and harsh.
And the risk there is huge, surely.
Oh, definitely. If the language of inclusion ends up being used to exclude people, the movement risks turning a vibrant, diverse group into more of an echo chamber. You end up prioritizing ideological agreement over, say, broad solidarity. And that can stifle growth, discourage critical thinking, and ultimately weaken the movement's ability to act together. Its vitality suffers.
And Neidinger doesn't just present this pain abstractly. He gives it context, really crucial context, by talking about his own history, his long involvement. He makes it absolutely clear, doesn't he? He says, I've been here long before some even knew what pride meant. I fought for marriage equality, for visibility, for dignity.
Mm-hmm. That history is key.
This isn't someone new to the scene or an outsider criticizing. This is someone who's been on the front lines for, well, for decades, a veteran. And he talks about concrete things, grassroots stuff. He says, I've stood in schools, sat at kitchen tables, faced down silence, hatred, doubt, and I answered with stories, with patience, with love.
Yeah, that paints a powerful picture.
It really does. It gives you the sense of grounded, face-to-face work, building bridges through just talking, through shared humanity, and knowing that history completely changes how you understand his pain now, right? His disillusionment isn't coming from ignorance or indifference.
No, not at all. It comes from deep commitment, huge personal investment.
It's that specific, painful thing of seeing something you poured your life into changing in ways that somehow make you feel unwelcome, like a stranger in your own house, even though you helped build it.
That historical context is absolutely vital. It elevates his critique way beyond just complaining. This is a voice from the movement's core, not the edges. His loyalty, his deep personal stake, makes his current feelings, the pain, the disillusionment, especially powerful. Poignant, as you said, it really highlights a potential tragedy within social movements, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The risk of pushing away your own experienced veterans, the ones who laid the groundwork, fought the early battle.
Yeah, definitely.
So when someone who's faced down silence, hatred, doubt, with stories, patience, and love, now feels accused and dismissed by their own people, it signals a really serious internal split. His struggle becomes this plea from within, asking for a deeper talk about where the movement is going, how it operates internally, a talk that needs to acknowledge and respect everyone's contributions, past and present. And that deep commitment really sets the stage for his core struggle now with how things are today. It makes us look at his specific points of friction with more empathy, I think, a more nuanced view.
And those friction points are where it gets really specific, aren't they? Especially when he talks about what he calls the limit of comprehension and language. He's very upfront about what's overwhelming him. He says, if someone identifies as a transfluid, genderqueer, trigender lesbian who sometimes feels like a dog, then honestly, I don't know how to explain that anymore.
It's a striking example.
And he adds he can't explain it, not in classrooms, not in media interviews, not even to myself. Now, this doesn't necessarily sound like rejection or, malice. It sounds more like a really honest admission of just being intellectually and emotionally overwhelmed.
Yeah, you can almost hear the exhaustion.
Right, like he's hit a wall where he feels he's losing touch with language, with people, with trust. It doesn't seem to be about denying identity, but more about the real challenge of integrating these complex, very personal ideas into a shared public understanding, especially for advocacy, where clarity matters so much.
That feeling resonates, doesn't it?
Totally. Anyone trying to keep up with rapid changes in identity, tech, whatever, can probably relate to that feeling of hitting a personal limit. It raises that crucial question. How do we balance the absolute need for individual self-expression with the practical need for, well, collective understanding, for coherent communication in a broad social movement?
That's exactly the tension his monologue exposes so well. It's inherent in any movement that wants to be both radically inclusive and achieve broad societal change. Because while individual identity is, of course, sacred, personal, fluid, a movement aiming for widespread acceptance and legal progress often needs shared language, shared concepts to get its message across.
Both internally and externally.
Precisely. Internally, among all its diverse members, and externally to the wider public whose support you need. Now, in your specific example, the transfluid, genderqueer, trigender lesbian who sometimes feels like a dog, it really starkly shows how extreme specificity, while totally valid for an individual,
Can become a communication barrier.
it can inadvertently become a barrier to collective action and broad understanding. If we extrapolate, you have to ask, is there a point where pursuing ultimate specificity, even with the best intentions of inclusion, actually becomes counterproductive? Counterproductive to the movement's ability to send a clear, unified message, especially to people still trying to grasp basic concepts or to external audiences you need to win over.
It's not about dismissing identities.
Not at all. It's about the pragmatic realities of building a movement and communicating effectively. It highlights that critical challenge. How does a movement evolve its internal language without alienating potential allies, or even longtime members who just struggle to keep up with rapid linguistic shifts?
And this worry about clarity leads him straight into concerns about the price of clarity and legitimacy for the movement itself. He voices this deep fear that the community he fought for might be undermining its own credibility by moving too fast, maybe, or too broadly, without enough internal integration. He says, really vividly, "I've fought too hard to be taken seriously to now feel like a clown in the conversation."
That's a powerful image.
Isn't it? The idea that decades of hard struggle for dignity, for respect, might now look like a performance or a joke. Just because he's struggling to keep pace with every new term, and he pushes further, saying, "I'm expected to unpack a new label every month. I can't, and honestly, I don't want to."
It's more than just personal tiredness.
Exactly. It feels like a strategic worry about the movement's public image, its political effectiveness. He argues directly that not everything that's felt needs to be a political identity,
Right.
and not every new self-description needs to be sacred. He even has that sharp little line, sometimes too much inclusion just becomes confusion, which hits that really crucial, delicate balance for any movement aiming for mainstream acceptance, for broad political impact. How do you embrace and validate these incredibly diverse, fluid individual identities, while also keeping a coherent, unified, understandable face for the public? Especially when, as he points out later, you're still fighting for basic rights in so many places.
That point about clarity and legitimacy raises an absolutely essential and deeply complex question for any social movement, really. What is the right balance between radical, ever-expanding inclusion and maintaining that coherent, understandable public face you need for advocacy? Nedinger is voicing a legitimate concern, I think, about the movement's ability to keep its perceived seriousness, its effectiveness, in the eyes of the wider world.
The fear being loss of impact.
The fear he expresses is that if the definition of community becomes too wide or changes too fast, without enough internal processing and clear communication, it risks losing its power to advocate effectively for core issues, safety, legal rights, basic dignity.
Yeah.
Again, it's not about shutting down identity or denying experience. It's about the practical side of social change.
Right.
When a movement seems to be constantly redefining itself, its core ideas, it can become really hard for outsiders and even many insiders to grasp its fundamental goals. That clown in the conversation metaphor really captures that feeling of lost authority, lost seriousness, a fear that years of hard-won respect could be chipped away by internal debates that to outsiders just seem confusing or esoteric. So this concern for clarity and legitimacy is strategic, born from wanting the movement to stay impactful and understood, not sidelined by its own internal complexities.
And this growing worry about the movement's future as he sees it, it leads to that really poignant metaphor, the bridge being torn down. He says he feels the community is tearing it down from the inside by pretending that every new definition is truth and every question is violence. Now, this bridge he talks about, it's not just a random image, is it? It represents decades of incredibly hard, often painful work.
Building understanding.
Exactly. Building understanding, fostering empathy, earning acceptance between the LGBTQIA+ community and the wider world. Think of all the stories shared, the patient talks at kitchen tables, the efforts to explain, to humanize. That bridge was built painstakingly, right?
Yeah.
On vulnerability, empathy, shared ground. So the accusation that asking questions or even just admitting you don't understand something is the same as violence, that's incredibly powerful and potentially damaging.
It implies that real dialogue is just being shut down.
Yeah.
That there's no room for dissent or thoughtful skepticism or even just basic human confusion.
Yeah, if every honest question is seen as an attack,
Then genuine engagement becomes impossible, doesn't it? It creates an environment where people might just shut up, self-censor, or pull away entirely.
the bridge metaphor is devastatingly accurate, I think. It symbolizes that fragile, essential connection built over generations.
And when he says it's being torn down from the inside, it points to the unique danger of self-inflicted wounds within movements, accusing any question, any honest doubt, any struggle to keep up as violence. It effectively shuts down curiosity, internal debate, the very processes of learning and adapting that healthy movements need.
So it harms the movement itself.
It absolutely can. It stifles internal growth, diversity of thought. And it can also isolate allies people who might be deeply supportive but get put off by what looks like an increasingly rigid, unforgiving internal conversation. It forces us to think about how any movement manages that tricky balance, keeping internal cohesion while also engaging, educating, and winning over outsiders. How can a movement really grow its impact if it seems hostile to those outside its immediate circle? or even hostile to its own longstanding members who just express honest doubts or need clearer
It
explanations.
risks becoming isolated.
Yeah, becoming a kind of self-contained bubble, cut off from the very world it wants to change.
And just to be really clear about where he's coming from, making sure his critique isn't just dismissed as, being anti-progress, Nightingale draws some crucial lines. He says explicitly, I'm not against change. I'm against chaos. I'm not against identity. I'm against detachment. I'm not against progress. I'm against losing the thread completely.
That clarification is so important.
It really is. It gives you this much more nuanced picture of his position. It pushes back against simple claims that he's just resisting change or doesn't get new identities. He's not arguing for things to stay the same. He's worried about the how and the direction of the change.
Yeah, the methods.
Right. He sees a big difference between organic evolution, building on what's there, adding new things, but keeping a core, and what he feels is happening now, which seems more like fragmentation, unraveling, losing the thread. For him, progress should lead to more unity, more impact, not internal chaos. It's about keeping a coherent story, a shared purpose, a collective identity that doesn't accidentally leave people behind while trying to expand definitions.
Essentially saying, let's move forward, but thoughtfully.
Exactly. Let's do it without losing sight of what unites us, what core principles we're fighting for.
And that clarification is absolutely essential to grasp his full perspective. It moves the discussion beyond just pro-change versus anti-change. He's really voicing a common anxiety that pops up in movements going through rapid growth and diversification. How do you bring in new understandings, new identities, new ways of talking and being, without accidentally weakening the core cohesion and shared purpose that got the movement its early wins and broad appeal?
That tension is always there, isn't it?
It really is. Those distinctions he makes, change versus chaos, identity versus detachment, progress versus losing the thread, they highlight his belief that evolution is vital, but it needs to be purposeful, anchored, ultimately strengthening, not fragmenting. He's arguing for a kind of progress that stays grounded in shared purpose and effective, accessible communication, rather than what he sees as a potential slide into internal confusion and isolation. It also really sharpens the focus on that inherent tension between the individual's right to define themselves, which is absolutely sacred and vital, and the group's practical need for common language and narrative to hit those broader societal goals and keep solidarity across different subgroups.
And this worry about internal cohesion leads him to ask this really sobering, poignant question about the silent majority within the community. He wonders aloud, how many people out there are staying silent, not because they hate us, but because they can't follow us anymore? How many gay and lesbian voices feel like strangers in their own house?
That's a powerful question.
Isn't it? It's not just about his own feelings. It's this deep concern that maybe his experience isn't unique, that it reflects something broader, maybe unspoken within large parts of the LGBTQIA+ community. He seems to be particularly hinting at older gay and lesbian folks, the ones who often took the brunt of the early fights, who might feel this growing disconnect.
Because the language and culture are shifting so fast.
Exactly, because the language, the perceived core ideas, the cultural markers seem to be changing so dramatically, so quickly. It really flags that serious risk of internal marginalization, where even longtime, deeply committed members start feeling like outsiders, strangers in their own house, if they can't keep up with or fully sign on to every evolving ideological or linguistic demand.
And that silence is worrying.
Very. The potential for this internal silence raises huge questions about how truly inclusive a movement is if it might be inadvertently alienating its own veterans. It creates a kind of chilling effect, maybe, where genuine doubts just don't get voiced, and that can't be healthy for the movement long term.
No, it can't. And this is such a critical observation because it touches on something you see in many rapidly changing social contexts. This emergence of a silent majority. People who aren't actively hostile but feel increasingly alienated or just unable to participate fully. Nightingale's feelings probably aren't isolated. They might well reflect a wider, perhaps unspoken sentiment in the community, especially among older gay and lesbian individuals whose identities were shaped in very different times.
Highlighting that risk of internal marginalization.
Exactly, where people who once felt central now feel like outsiders in their own house, just because the goalposts, the language, the norms shifted without enough dialogue, explanation, or room for different paces of understanding. And this internal struggle, happening in a relatively advanced Western context, it naturally pushes us to think globally, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, if these internal divisions are so sharp within a movement that's already won significant rights and social acceptance, what kind of message does that send? What does it mean for communities around the world who are still fighting for the most basic human rights, for the right even to exist?
Ah, right. And that's exactly where the monologue shifts, isn't it? To that stark global perspective. It introduces this deeply ironic, painful contrast. Nadinger points out, while we fight over identity terms and in-community wars, others are still fighting for the right to love to exist at all.
The contrast is jarring.
It really is. And he gives specific, harrowing examples of where these fundamental fights are still raging. In many parts of Asia, in Eastern Europe, and parts of Africa, being gay is still criminalized, marriage is still banned, visibility is still dangerous. He's drawing this clear, undeniable line between the internal, sometimes abstract debates in the quote-unquote advanced West and the literal life-or-death realities for LGBTQIA plus people elsewhere.
It forces a reevaluation.
Absolutely. It raises that crucial, uncomfortable question: is the Western LGBTQIA plus movement, having achieved so much, relatively speaking, becoming too inward-looking, too absorbed in its own complexities? Is it losing sight of the basic human rights battle still going on globally?
It really forces you to think about priorities. And it's a stark reminder of the privilege involved in debating specific identity terms when basic existence is still under threat elsewhere.
That powerful contrast really frames the urgency of his message, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Pushing us to think about privilege and responsibility within social movements.
When a movement makes big gains in one place, the ethical and strategic question has to be, how do you use that hard-won privilege to effectively support those in much tougher, even dangerous situations? Neidinger is implicitly saying that these internal arguments, these linguistic complexities in Western movements, they're a kind of luxury. A luxury that communities facing criminalization, violence, state-sponsored discrimination just cannot afford. It forces that stark comparison. Fighting for recognition of a highly specific identity in a largely accepting society versus fighting for the basic right to exist without fear of prison, torture, or death. This part of the monologue is a profound call for global solidarity, really, a call to reassess priorities, urging the Western movement to remember and focus on its foundational goal: universal human rights and safety.
And he gets even sharper when he talks about exporting fracture, not freedom. This is where his critique feels particularly acute and, frankly, quite chilling. He directly criticizes the advanced West for exporting a movement that seems fractured, obsessed with language, locked in internal battles that push away anyone who hesitates.
That's a heavy charge.
It is. He argues that what's being sent out is a version of community so complicated and moralistic they're not sure if it's even safe to join us. Think about what that implies. A profound, dangerous risk. That the very movements that should be beacons of hope and solidarity are instead seen as unwelcoming, confusing, maybe even risky by those who desperately need support.
Yeah, imagine being in a country where being gay is illegal.
Exactly. You risk your life just trying to connect with a global community. And if that community looks like it's in chaos, fighting itself over definitions, quick to ostracize its own, how do you find the strength, the comfort, the desire to join?
You could totally alienate the people who need global solidarity the most. The complexity, the perceived internal hostility becomes a barrier, not a bridge, for global outreach.
That's a critical point, demanding serious thought. It speaks directly to how internal dynamics play out on a global stage.
The worry is that the complexity, the internal fights within Western movements, rather than showing dynamic evolution, might just look like chaos, a fragmented, maybe unwelcoming environment to international allies and oppressed communities. It raises fundamental questions about how effective it is to export an activism model that seems overly complex or punitive internally.
So what message reaches those on the front lines globally?
Well, if the message is one of internal division, rigid purity tests, constant redefinition, what does that do for global LGBTQIA plus activism? Does it dilute the core message of universal human rights, safety, dignity? It underscores the huge responsibility of movements in privileged positions to present a clear, unified, accessible front to the world, especially when so much is still at stake for so many people facing extreme oppression. The fear is, instead of inspiring hope and offering a clear path, this fractured image might sow confusion, fear, more isolation, making it harder for people in dangerous situations to connect with or seek support from the global movement.
And the ultimate, most devastating outcome, as Nadinger frames it, is draining strength and forgetting the core fight. He issues this stark warning that these internal battles risk draining the strength of those who could have stood beside us, those who still need us, those who still believe in us, those who want to fight the fight we may already be forgetting.
A powerful call to refocus.
Absolutely. A plea to remember the stakes. He's directly suggesting that the huge energy, the valuable resources, the crucial emotional bandwidth being spent on internal ideological fights and language debates, it's actively diverting focus and power from the fundamental, often life-or-death struggles still defining the LGBTQIA+ experience for millions worldwide.
It's opportunity cost.
Exactly. When a movement gets bogged down in internal debates, it risks losing sight of its main unifying mission: basic human rights, safety, dignity for everyone, everywhere.
This isn't just strategy. It feels like a moral imperative he's pointing to. A reminder that unity, clear purpose, a shared, understandable message, these aren't just nice ideas. They're powerful, essential tools in a global fight against deep prejudice and systemic oppression. Every moment spent on internal conflict is a moment not spent fighting for those whose lives are still on the line.
Precisely. It highlights that profound, tragic opportunity cost of internal fragmentation on the wider, urgent fight for basic rights and safety globally.
Every bit of energy, every moment of focus, every ounce of emotional resilience used up in internal ideological debates or linguistic purity tests in the West is, in Nidinger's view, strength diverted from the critical work needed globally. He's stressing how clarity of purpose, unity of message aren't just preferences, they're powerful strategic necessities in a global struggle against deep prejudice and violence.
Yeah.
When the core fight is for existence, for the basic right to love and be safe, internal divisions become this costly luxury that undermines the very people the movement exists to serve and protect. And this global call to action, reminding us of the huge human stakes, it brings us right back to Nidinger's very personal decision, his vision for the movement's future. Grounding his individual experience in that broader, universal context of shared humanity and purpose.
So with all this internal friction laid bare, Nidinger then makes this really powerful, crucial statement about his own identity. It's like an anchor point in all this shifting sand, a stance of persistence, dialogue, and bridging divides. He states it very simply, fundamentally. I'm gay, not queer, not fluid, not in progress, just gay, and that should still be enough to belong.
A very clear declaration.
It's such a powerful reclaiming of a core identity. For him, it means belonging. It's a clear, understandable, stable foundation. And it's a direct, courageous challenge to that implicit idea that you have to constantly adopt new labels or subscribe to a broader, maybe more complex, ever-shifting ideology to be seen as valid as enough within the community.
Asserting identity on his own terms.
Exactly, based on what feels authentic and grounded to him. And demanding that this be recognized as sufficient for inclusion, it's a poignant moment, makes you think deeply about how we each define ourselves within these broader social structures, right? And how much external validation or specific labels we feel we need to truly belong, to feel seen.
That personal declaration is incredibly significant. It's a deliberate act of self-definition in a climate where identity can feel endlessly shifting. He reestablishes this fundamental identity, just gay, which for him carries clear historical, social, personal meaning. In a time when identity is often seen as infinitely fluid, always expanding, his assertion of a more defined or at least self-determined foundation is a powerful counterpoint.
Asking if there should be a baseline.
Exactly. It highlights that important question for movements aiming for radical inclusion. Is there a baseline identity, forged through decades of struggle, shared experience, that should always count as enough for belonging, for solidarity? Regardless of extra descriptors or evolving ideas, his statement isn't about stopping progress or rejecting new identities. It feels more about ensuring that those who identify with fundamental terms still feel they have a secure, valued place. That their history isn't made irrelevant by new language or frameworks. It's a plea for foundational respect.
And despite all the pain, all the alienation he expresses so clearly, he ultimately makes this profound choice. His decision to stay. He says, I'm staying, not because it's easy, but because I refuse to leave without saying what needs to be said. I'm still here, still trying.
That's incredibly powerful.
It really is. It's not resignation, not defeat. It feels like an act of profound love, actually, and defiance, driven by this deep, lasting belief in what the movement could be, should be. He's not jumping ship, even with the perceived chaos inside. He's choosing to stay on board, actively, to push for change, for a return to what he sees as core values from within.
And he clarifies why, doesn't he?
Yeah, not for applause, not for power, but because I believe we were once a movement that meant everyone, not just the loudest.
This commitment to staying, despite the huge difficulty, the personal cost, it changes his critique from just complaint into this powerful call for internal accountability, for a return to principles of broad inclusion, shared purpose.
It's a refusal to let the movement drift without fighting for its soul, for its original promise to truly mean everyone.
His decision to stay is definitely one of the most powerful and maybe hopeful parts of the whole monologue. It really underlines this deep, unwavering commitment to the community. It shows his critique comes from a place of deep investment, love, care, not detachment or wanting to leave. His staying is an act of both love and defiance, right? A testament to his belief in the movement's core ideals, even when he seriously struggles with how things are playing out now.
Challenges the idea that disagreement equals disloyalty.
Totally. It challenges that often unspoken idea that disagreeing means you're disloyal, or that critiquing from inside is like betrayal. Instead, it frames his voice as necessary, maybe painful, but part of internal accountability, part of dialogue. It suggests true belonging sometimes means having the courage, the resilience, to say uncomfortable things to the people you're most aligned with. It really speaks to that incredible human resilience, that enduring hope. That even when you're deeply disappointed, commitment to shared values, believe in the potential for things to get better, can and should win out.
And flowing right from that commitment to stay is his call for courageous dialogue. It's not just about sticking around quietly. It's about active, often hard, engagement. His message to others who might feel lost or alienated is direct, empowering. So if you feel this too, stay, speak, doubt, reach out.
An invitation to resist silence.
Exactly. Voice your concerns, actively seek connection, understanding, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you disagree. And he spells out this core belief. Community doesn't begin with shared hashtags, but with the courage to sit across from someone who doesn't agree with you and still say, you matter.
That gets to the heart of real community.
Doesn't it? It prioritizes empathy, open talk, human connection as the foundation, not rigid adherence to specific ideologies or, performative agreement. It's about seeing the inherent worth in people, even when your views clash hard. It forces us to ask, how do we actually build and keep community going amidst deep disagreement and fast-changing norms? And practically, how do movements create spaces where dissent, honest questions can exist without instantly causing splits, ostracization, or just shutting down vital conversations?
It's a challenge to build bridges, not walls.
Precisely. Bridges of understanding, not walls of ideological purity.
And this call for courageous dialogue, it represents such a crucial philosophical and practical question for any movement today, navigating intense internal pressures and external polarization. Leidinger is pushing for a return to a more fundamental kind of human connection and conversation, something that maybe predates the digital age's focus on shared hashtags, performative activism, and ideological lockstep.
That line about sitting across from someone.
Sit across from someone who doesn't agree with you and still say, you matter. That's a truly radical act of empathy and intellectual humility in today's polarized world, isn't it? It champions genuine human connection over rigid ideological alignment. It suggests a movement's real strength isn't in its monolithic purity, but in its capacity for robust, even difficult internal talk. Its ability to hold real space for different views.
So questioning isn't violence, it's engagement.
That seems to be the implication. For movements to truly evolve, adapt, sustain themselves, they absolutely need transparent ways for internal debate and dissent that don't immediately collapse into accusations of bad faith or disloyalty. This approach suggests that the long-term health, the vitality, the true inclusivity of a movement heavily depends on fostering that kind of courageous, empathetic dialogue, where asking questions is seen as engaging, not attacking.
And finally, Leidinger frames his whole perspective, his unique position, his hope, as coming from the voice from the bridge. He identifies himself. Lóng Tíng, a gay writer walking between East and West. I don't speak from one side, I speak from the bridge, and I'll keep speaking. Not louder, but deeper.
That's a really crucial framing.
Yeah, it's a key meta point about his vantage point, the credibility he brings.
Yeah.
His identity as walking between East and West suggests this nuanced cross-cultural view. It goes beyond purely Western debates about identity politics, giving his critique extra weight, universal relevance maybe. He's not stuck in one cultural box.
And speaking from the bridge.
That implies this deliberate choice to be in a connecting space, one that actively seeks understanding across divides rather than digging into one camp, and his commitment to speaking deeper rather than louder louder, that's a powerful statement about the kind of conversation he thinks we need for healing, for real progress.
Substance over volume.
Exactly. A clear preference for thoughtful, meaningful talk. For introspection, nuance over shouting matches or performative posturing. It's a call for a more profound, considered conversation, one that acknowledges complexity, honors different experiences, and actively looks for common ground, even amidst difference.
That self-identification as speaking from the bridge is perhaps the most defining, powerful aspect of the whole monologue. It gives us a framework for understanding his unique insights. It signals a position that deliberately goes beyond simple binaries, not just east-west, but maybe also past-present, or the old guard versus the new wave within the community itself. His choice to speak deeper, not louder, is a profound statement about the kind of discourse he believes is truly necessary for genuine healing, sustainable growth, and real impact in social movements.
Seeking understanding over just winning the argument.
Precisely. It suggests a preference for introspection, for unpacking complex layers, for nuance, and for fostering genuine understanding over superficial activism or aggressive posturing. This is the voice of someone calling for reconciliation, for building authentic understanding across internal divides, and for remembering the broader humanistic goals of a movement that really, at its heart, seeks love, dignity, safety, and that deep sense of belonging for everyone. Regardless of evolving terms or internal disagreements, it's a powerful, enduring message for anyone navigating the complexities of identity and community in our rapidly changing world.
So this deep dive into Egg's monologue, it really pushes us to think critically, doesn't it? About what belonging truly means, how movements evolve organically versus when they might risk fragmenting, and just the enduring, vital power of one single, honest voice speaking from a place of deep commitment.
Absolutely. And if we connect it to the bigger picture, it's such a powerful, timely reminder that progress isn't always a straight line. And that robust internal dialogue, even when it's painful, uncomfortable, challenging, is absolutely essential for a movement's long-term health, for its cohesion, its global impact.
Yeah.
It highlights that often overlooked challenge.
Yeah.
How do you maintain internal solidarity, a shared sense of purpose, while also pursuing radical inclusion and adapting to constantly evolving understandings of identity? The balance is incredibly delicate, and the consequences of getting it wrong can be huge, both for individuals inside who feel alienated and for the movement's collective ability to achieve its bigger universal goals worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely. What's so compelling here is how Nidinger's raw personal vulnerability just unlocks these universal, timeless questions about community, identity, evolution, the quiet courage it takes to speak your truth, even when it might be unpopular with the people you stand with. It challenges us to think about what inclusive space really means, one that not only welcomes new voices and evolving ideas, but also profoundly honors the history, the hard-won contributions, the enduring identities of those who bravely paved the way. So what does all this mean for you listening now? As you think about your own communities, the groups you're part of, the conversations or the silences happening there, it leaves us with this compelling, maybe unsettling thought. How do we make sure that in our relentless drive for progress, for expanded definitions, we don't accidentally silence, alienate, or leave behind the very voices who champion the cause for decades? Or those globally who still desperately need a clear, unified, welcoming message of hope and liberation? That's all for this deep dive. Thank you for listening, for staying with us, and for engaging with this inherent complex tension between what we are, what we're becoming, and what we fundamentally long to be. Until next time.